Good morning, friends from Canada. I'm speaking to you from Switzerland. It's now 5:30 here. I'm waiting for our next guests, Akimbo and Andrea. Where are you? Oh, here you are. Thank you. I'm glad and happy that you joined. I want to thank you all for organizing this with us, giving us this opportunity, and say how happy I am to be with you joining in this section. I would like to say just a few words about myself. I'm originally from Brazil. I'm living in Switzerland for a while, and I'm very much engaged in the water privatization issues. I publish regularly articles on this issue, and I'm a very close friend of the Wellington Water Watchers and other organizations in Canada. I would pass the word to Akimbo to introduce himself.
My name is Akimbo Deluafemi. I'm the Executive Director of Corporate Accountability and Public Participation Africa, CAPA.
Andrea, would you like to say a few words about yourself, to introduce yourself?
Yep. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Andrea Mudebath, and I am a professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto. And in the last 5 years, I've been working with groups of people, movements of people who've been fighting water privatization in Europe.
Thank you, Andrea. So I'd like to make a very broad general statement on the situation as I see it. I think there is a kind of neoliberal attack all over the world right now against the common good, against public service, and to take over resources from the planet to transnational corporations. There are, as I see, there are many ways of privatizing water. The most well-known one, the most well-spoken of, not well-spoken of, is the privatization of public water companies. Because this is happening mainly in big towns, trade unions are involved, so it's an issue that's very complicated to hide, so it's well known. Less well known is the fact that privatization of water seems to me can go through energy privatization. In the case, for instance, of dams, when if you privatize the dam, you are actually privatizing the river, or big irrigation projects, when the water then goes for irrigation and not for people. And one issue that for me is very hidden is water privatization, the direct water privatization through buying land to have access to water, or concessions to underground water obtained by big transnational corporations like Coca-Cola or Nestle. That's extremely linked to the bottled water sector, privatization of water through the bottled water sector. So these all together are like embedded in this neoliberal attack on the public services and public good. In my original country, Brazil, to give a very clear example, just a couple of months ago, with this extremely neoliberal government that we have, the Congress passed a law that make it, in practice, we are privatizing our entire public water system, all. And the privatization of water through companies buying land to have access to water and getting concessions from the government to take water from places like the well-known Guarani Aquifer. It's a fact that's going on. And fighting water privatization at this level is very complicated because this is not happening in big towns. This is not happening on the view of people. This is happening in the interior of the country, far away from people, you know. So these are my general comments. I would like very much to listen to Akimbo's view on that, because Latin America and Africa are the countries where most of the remaining natural resources of the world are. And we are, as Africans and as Latin Americans, the main target of the neoliberal attack on public good and public services.
Okay. Thank you very much, Franklin. Of course, we all know there's chronic water problems across Africa. And, the water systems in Africa are very stressed. They are dysfunctional and extremely inefficient. Demand is way, way higher than what public utilities can provide as a result of decayed infrastructure, mismanagement, regulatory failures. But most importantly is the influence of the World Bank and international financial institutions like the IFC. And of course, the influence of the big water corporations like Veolia, Suez, Ambegua, and the rest of them. And of course, as you rightly mentioned, we will not forget, big water bottlers like Nestle and Coca-Cola. And then what do we have on this continent is that majority of the people lack access to clean, potable water. And that about 220 million people in Africa lack access. And that represents about 40% of people that doesn't have access to water in the world. So, and what have you seen recently, as we said, is the what I call the onslaught of the big water corporations, where privatization, PPP has been, the order of the day. Lagos, which is the city where we launched what we call the Water Rights campaign in 2015, has about 21 million people, with less than 10% having connection to public water utility. But findings shows that since the 1970s, Lagos State has been taking all sorts of loans from the World Bank, EU, DFID, in order to, quote and unquote, improve the water infrastructure. But only for us to discover that all these loans were schemed in order to turn the arms of the government towards privatization and, turning water to a commodity. What we see in Lagos is that as early as the year 2004, they began to introduce some legislations to pave the way for privatization, and they, according to them, they want to commercialize, the water infrastructure, and then they move ahead again to what is now known as the PPP, arrangement. I must say that we were able to get what they call the Lagos State Water Master Plan. And this water master plan never in any way mentioned anything about the human rights to water. It only talks about how, the Lagos resident can pay for water. And what are the issues that we have, tried to challenge? We think the issue at stake is the human right to water. We think that this is a social justice issue, equity, and that the commodification of water will, lead to a situation where only those people that can afford water will be able to get water. And also there are issues like climate change and labor. And so we began to build that mass power. And because to us, the only way we can challenge water privatization is to again get the people to reclaim, power, to be able to conduct mass action, and to be able to shift the political and policy agenda. So what we started doing through our Water Rights campaign was to create a movement that comprises labor, CSOs, and local communities. For local communities, we created what we call the water parliament. And the water parliaments really can be as small as 10, 20, 50 people sitting under the tree to discuss issues of water. And then they begin to become very strong voices in our campaign. Of course, we also created what we call the African Women Hygiene Network. But I must stress this particular important thing that people need to note about our campaign, that we ensure that we campaign shoulder to shoulder with our global north, friends and allies. So we were conducting joint campaigns because the issue of water is not restricted to a community. This is becoming like a global agenda for corporations to gradually erode the public space and privatize the little rights that we fought for and our forefathers fought for years. So we work with organizations like Corporate Accountability, PSI, Transnational Institute, in our campaign. And what we did was these campaign things that we normally do, but we're doing that from a movement strategy, petitions, rallies, sit-outs. We did a lot of publication, and I must tell you that at some point, the Lagos state government, for instance, challenged us and said, look, there is no alternative to PPP. And then we have to bring our allies, our resources together, invite our friends at the Global North to conduct research about the way out, about research into remunicipalization across the world, and present what we call the alternative to the Lagos water crisis. We also took our campaign to the UN Rapporteur on water, and several times Leo Heller has written in support of the campaign in Lagos, and of course to the US Congress. What I can say about our campaign is that once again, we again come to terms that for us to change the tide of neoliberalism, neocolonialism, extreme capitalism, and everything, every force around the world that is starting to deny us our right, is that we need to build, grass to top kind of movement. We need mass movement of our people to rally around us. So I can tell you that our story is a story of a movement. And I can also say that this movement is growing. As I said earlier, it's a movement of labor activists, CSOs, opinion leaders, religious leaders, market women, women, ordinary women, and ordinary citizens. And this movement has been able to record some incredible successes that are hardly seen in Nigeria. When the Lagos state government criminalizes the informal water sector, we rallied strongly and we got them to remove the anti-people sections of the law. We have grown from being a Lagos campaign into a national campaign. We are also currently working in developing our regional strategies. We have been able to slow down the clock of privatization in Lagos. And if anybody is following the trend in Nigeria today, the story now is that the big water corporations want to take over the entire water bodies of this country. So we now have a national law called the National Water Resources Bill. And for the past 4 weeks or 3 weeks, we've been now building a mass movement of stakeholders in Nigeria that has challenged a national law once again, and that law has not been able to move forward. What I would just say in summary is that the attempt by big corporations to take over our water is real. The attempt by big bottlers to take over our rivers, when local communities, go to take their domestic water is real, as the case of Nestle in Nigeria that we also challenge. But that I'm one of those people that think that we should go back and get our people organized and create movement around the world to build the resistance to these corporations, and that it is possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to make, before passing to you, then, Andrea, the word just to clarify, because you mentioned some things that maybe to our readers are not clear. So just to make it clear, PPPs are public-private partnerships. Akinbode also mentioned Roberto Heller. Heller is the current United Nations rapporteur on the right to water. He's a Brazilian. And the IFC, International Finance Corporation, is a branch of the World Bank, which is engaged primarily in privatization process. And IFC was extremely engaged in all privatization process in African countries. And they just opened an office like 1 year ago in Brazil, just to clarify to our listeners this institution that you mentioned. So, Andrea, please, we'd like to listen to you.
Yes, thank you, Akinbode and Franklin. I wanted to kind of quickly talk about three themes, and one is to pay attention to the privatization of water, and I'm specifically going to speak about public water utilities. The other thing I wanted to make sure that our viewers kind of hear about is the financialization of these water utilities. And what I mean here is that, yes, we are dealing with water corporations, but more and more water utilities are actually dealing with financial actors that have a lot of liquidity, billions and billions of dollars that they want to sink into infrastructure. So here I'm actually talking about private equity firms. So Nestle, Suez, Veolia, yes, they're here. But we need to also think about private equity firms. And what I want to talk about today is actually pension funds in the global north that are very, very important actors in the financialization of public water utilities. And as Akinbode just said, many public water utilities in the global south, after decades of structural adjustment, IMF and World Bank generated structural adjustment, are now in a situation of such breakdown that they are desperate for funding, and that funding is very forthcoming in the form of corporate funding, but more and more private equity firms and pension funds especially. So the situation has been created such that public utilities are desperate for funding from elsewhere. I agree that public utilities everywhere are arguing that there is no alternative to public-private partnerships. What they often also argue is that because the utility has been transformed into a joint stock company, they often still own, the public hand often still owns, say, 51% of the shares. And they often argue that, private actors only own, a minority of the shares, say 49% of the shares. So we still have a say in what's going to happen with the utility. That is often not the case at all. We need to understand that once a utility is financialized, it becomes a joint stock company, and the whole culture of what used to be a public utility profoundly changes, and it consists of these sort of clashing mandates. On the one hand, it's a utility that is supposed to offer services, a vital service to citizens. On the other hand, the mandate of shareholders is, of course, entirely organized around return of investment. So no matter what people say, politicians say when they say that, it's not entirely privatized, the processes that are unleashed by PPPs are always those of total profit seeking. In terms of North-South solidarities, I think that, us in the global North, we can be solidaristic with, activists in the global South. But I think really what we need to do is start here where we are locally, because these global actors, like the Canadian Union of Public Employees, where I am getting my pension, CUPE, and which has in fact funded and supported this conference. CUPE is one of the forerunners of investing in public infrastructures in the global South. This is very, very important, that my public pension fund is investing billions into the privatization of water utilities and many other public utilities like hospitals, schools, and so on, outside of Canada. And of course, these investments on the part of Canadian pension funds have radical implications for the wages and the benefits and the working and living conditions of, you know, labor in the global south. But at the same time, you know, what I hear, there are many critical voices in QP, but it's not a generalized critique of where our money, our pension money, is actually invested. So I'm very buoyed to hear that Akinbode says that labor is involved in fighting the privatization of water utilities in Lagos. I hope that that the labor unions in Lagos can reach out to labor unions in the global north, specifically also labor unions like CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and ask for help and solidarity such that a critical and ethical conversation can emerge around where our public money actually goes. So that would be a very concrete way to forge even more north-south solidarities, I think.
Thank you very, very much, Andrea, for this reminding us about the pension funds and the role of the North countries. I'd like to briefly say that embedded in the concept public-private partnership, there is a kind of message that already undermines democracies. Why? Think about it. Public, private. The public remains, it's actually governments. So you are putting elected governments, which the base of our democracies, in the same level as the private sector that you are partnering with. Actually, no company, no one can be partner of the government. They are the authority, they were elected for that. So the concept of public-private partnership, it's already sending a message that elected governments are at the same level of private corporations. They are partners. And this is a process that it's coming from long ago, since the 70s. The World Bank, as both mentioned, has been helping to undermine public water facilities in the southern countries since the 70s, the 80s. And then we came to the point that Andrea just mentioned, that these companies need money. Of course, they have been undermined for 20 years. Both, I would like to listen to your opinions on that, to your experience with that.
Bode, I think you're muted there. Is anyone hearing him?
We are not listening to you, both.
Okay, so can you hear me now? Yeah, I mean, I said first is to thank Andrea on the issue of union in the global south, reaching out to the union in the global north, which I think it's something we're going to discuss with them because we work very closely. And as I said earlier, we are working with PSI. And issues about how pensions are deployed into corporations around the world are also involving unethical practices are also very extremely important. Back to Franklin. Look, you are absolutely right that there is actually, for me, it's very difficult to reconcile the agenda of the PPP, as if I'm going to put it like that, and our democratic government. I just think that the PPP arrangement, it's a very careful way to legalize corruption and stealing, particularly in my own part of the world. And we have countless examples of privatization and PPPs that have failed, that I cannot run. In Nigeria, they try transportation. They try transportation in Lagos, and at the end of the day, a road that the state had almost finished, about 60%, a private corporation came, and at the end of that contract, the state paid like 300% of what they could have used originally to construct the road. We had that in the waste management sector, that a corporation called Visionscape was brought in. It was eventually became what we call Vision Scam. And it took another movement like this to terminate that contract. I think what we actually need to do is that as much as we are acting local, like we're doing, it's also that we also build that global connection about connecting with communities where these corporations have done similar things. There are also some weaknesses in terms of the capacity of the global south and the regime under which we operate. Take, for instance, sometimes when we want to conduct research and digging into the activities of these corporations, at that point, we'll need the assistance of the global north. So we're building communities. We think that this resistance should be a movement, but also we act local and and connect with ourselves at the global level.
Andrea, would you like to comment on that?
There's maybe three things I just want to piggyback off what you just said, Franklin and Akimbode. I completely agree that it's, there's study after study that shows that public-private partnerships, including here by the Auditor General of Ontario, that most often, in the many, many PPPs we have here in Ontario, the public hand actually loses, because really public-private partnerships are really just a very complicated mechanism, a perfect, beautiful mechanism for private investors to dump money and then collect rent in the form of often very high interest. The article that I'm citing here by Kevin Scarrett on QP investing in water utilities in Chile says that the profits that are made there range between 10 and 25% returns of investment. So these are very, very lucrative ways in which money can be sort of rented out, so to speak, and then very high profits made. I think PSI, which Akimbode has mentioned, Public Services International, is an absolutely fabulous group that has also begun to seriously think about beyond the public-private partnership by looking at models of public-public partnership. That is to say, richer public utilities helping out other public utilities in the Global South, for example. I'm not a specialist on this, but I would encourage people who are interested in this to take a look at what Public Services International has been doing in terms of thinking about alternative models for PPP. There are many activists in Europe as well who are saying we need the public hand to understand that, sure, everyone is looking for money to, fix broken infrastructures, because there's been way too, not enough investments in the last few decades under conditions of austerity as well in Europe. But it's still much cheaper for public institutions to take out bank loans than it is for private institutions like these global investors and corporations to take out loans, because that's what they do. Like, they don't come with a suitcase of money and give it to the water utility in Nigeria. They're also taking out loans. And then with that argument, they say, well, we need to pay our own loans back. And that's why we need to ask for a contractually guaranteed return of investment, right? These return of investments are contractually guaranteed, and private, investors know that they have in some ways, access to sort of a monopoly service because everyone needs water. And it's a very, very secure investment. Water is one of the most secure investments today in a very volatile global economy. So, my guiding light has, as I said again, been critical labor unions and organizations like PSI, but also the people on the ground who are mobilizing massively in places like Europe. This is literally people, in mass demonstrations, mass referenda, but also taking, there's smaller local, because these are all very complexly nested corporations. Like, it's not Veolia that invests in like a southern Italian water utility. It's through all these subsidiary corporations. Sometimes they're taken to court, and sometimes these smaller local level justices of the peace make rulings in favor of water movements, and often they make an argument, like the lawyers for water movements make arguments like, we the people never agreed contractually to the selling off of this, vital service that is ours. It's not politicians who can just sell it off to anyone globally. This is our infrastructure, and we have built it through our taxation and through our labor over decades, and you don't have the right to just sell it off as if it was your own private property. This is collective property, and this is common property.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I think that your comments take us to the limits of the fight against water privatization inside a world capitalism structure. Because while the banking, for instance, there are enormous arguments, very good ones, to nationalizing the bank system. They should be a public sector, actually. So inside a capitalist frame of profit and the domination of this neoliberal capitalism frame, there is, I see, and I think after listening to you, a clear limit to what we can do to protect our public services. Bode, would you like to comment on that?
Just before anyone pops in, I just wanted to note that we're at 12 o'clock here. So there is a little bit of wiggle room if you want to continue chatting and if anyone wants to continue watching. So go ahead and keep it flowing. But I just wanted to tell you that I do have to hop off.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for everything you do. This has been amazing to listen to. You're all fonts of knowledge on this, and also just feel so inspired by your comments. So thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you.
So Bode, if you would like to comment on the limits of the political fight inside the capitalist frame.
Well, I often tell people that for us to achieve a just world, there is an ideological bent to what we're doing. And we cannot achieve change in the world, be it in the issue of water or climate change, healthcare, without challenging the ideological bent that tends to see the human person as an instrument of making money. And the more and more we reduce the power of capital and market forces on our lives, I think the better the world it's going to be for all of us. So first, back to the issue of water, is to see how the World Bank, for instance, can be able to promote development, that it's, advertise that it exists to promote, rather than to support capital all around the world. And then in setting our political agenda, I would speak to Africa that one of the biggest challenge we have now is that most of the governments in Africa now celebrate PPP, privatization as, what's going to take Africa out of the problem. So we also need to look at our democratic process, strengthening our democratic process to ensure that the people with the right political narratives eventually will be able to control democratic power. I think in as much as we try to run away from this kind of political agenda, we are every day coming back to that reality that there is a connection between those who are in charge of the public space, the political power, and the kind of policies that they make to control our lives. And so we cannot diverge the two.
Thank you very much, Bode. I do agree that it's very important to the entire movement to be aware of the political situation that's going on. For us in the southern countries, it's much easier than from you in the northern countries. That's clear to me. And I'd like to bring an example that's happening here in Switzerland, happening yesterday. The climate strike, because you mentioned climate change, the youth movement in Switzerland of the climate change, they did a wonderful demonstration this week. They occupied the main square in Bern, the capital where I live, to protest, to ask the Swiss government to take concrete action about climate change. And the way they have been treated by practically the entire political spectrum inside Switzerland and the press, the hostility was surprising to me. They were in colorful clothes with intelligence happenings in peace, just calling, come on, let's do something, you know? And the hostility of the press, it's unbelievable. And they got almost no support from practically any political party in Switzerland. 4 parliamentarians from the Green Party openly supported them, as stressed in their website. So this gives you a very good sign of how complicated the issue is in the northern countries when you tackle such issues. Andrea, if you'd like to mention something.
Well, I would love to say something that I learned from working with water movements in Germany and in Italy and in Ireland and elsewhere is, they always said to me that, we know what corporations do. Like, we know what private equity funds do. They're capitalist institutions and their only goal is to make money. So we're not going to change them. You can fight them, as Wellington Water Watches has done for many years now, amazingly against Nestle. But really, we are putting a lot of our emphasis on the question precisely of democracy and the political classes, because in theory, at least, they should be accountable to us. We can still vote them into power and vote them out of power. So, capitalists will be capitalists. They will never change. We know how capitalism works. But what we need to do is hold politicians accountable. So, and of course, the Italian water movement, for example, said that, when you think water, when you read the slogan of water is life, what we're really thinking is about democracy and the fact that all of these processes happened because of the profound de-democratization of our societies at the moment. I want to quickly, as a last point, mention something that Robert Ramsey, one of the viewers here, says, is that, the pension law here in Canada is a huge problem because it restricts pension law fund trustees from considering the ethical implications of certain investments. They have a responsibility. QP is legally mandated to prioritize return of investments and get as much returns as possible out of their investments. That's what they are legally mandated to do. And Robert Ramsey says the legal regime that governs the pension board trustee behavior needs some serious reform. The problem, I think if these laws were actually made subject to a discussion amongst QP members, the hundreds of thousands of QP members in Canada, I have no doubt that members would actually say, this is wrong. I don't want my money to be invested in ways that seriously compromises my, labor comrades in the South wages and life chances. I don't want this. So if there were a democratic conversation amongst members, I have no doubt that they wouldn't find that to be ethical. But again, we're at the problem of politics and law here. Is what is the legal framework? Is there any way that we can change it? And I think this Watershed event so far, thinking about the first intervention that was made by Kelsey Leonard, was so great because it is so much about laws that need to be made more accountable to democracy and democratic process and to the people ultimately.
Thank you, Andrea. But I don't think that this is a case of a particular law in Canada. I think that this obligation to have, it's general, that's the obligation of transnational corporations as well to their board of investors. They need to have return funds. That's in the law. But that brings back to the question of legality linked to the capitalism system, because the capitalism is not just the need for profits, not an abstract thing. The way where you really see capitalism embedded in real society, it's through the legal system.
Yes.
That's where
Absolutely.
it's really
Yes.
anchored.
Yeah. But, you know, who makes the laws and who breaks the laws? You know, there's a legislature that we can impact, you know, and that's part of the democratic process. These laws are, I mean, I completely agree that, you know, capitalism hinges on private property and the sort of protection of private property and you know, returns and things like that. But, you know, for me, I think this is one avenue that can be taken. I don't know what Akimbode says about this, but
I think what is very clear is the analogy Franklin made. Either we're calling it capitalism, but for this discussion, I just use the PPP, public and private. Now, the public is supposed to be public. The public is not encroaching on the private. But what we are seeing is that gradually the private is encroaching on the public. And what the private, or now let's use corporates, try to do is to compromise the democratic structures and the democratic institutions. And I gave the example of Lagos State. The goal, right from 2004, was to privatize. And they didn't announce to anyone that they were going to privatize. The first thing they did was to do what they call the strategic master plan, which I expectedly would say, oh, we don't have the money to, this is where we want to go to, and we don't have the money. Then they started, you know, amending and creating the laws that will create the environment that will allow the private to take over. So, and that is the trajectory as of today, that more and more laws that we're seeing in the global south is to promote the private corporations to begin to take over what traditionally what ought to be institutions and systems controlled democratically by the democratic and public institutions. So that, for me, is the bottom line today, to be able to resist these attempts by corporations taking over what is democratically or what is supposed to be our democratic rights. And that is where the South, if not the entire world, is today, where corporations want to completely, totally rule our world and write the rules and the laws by proxy. They sponsor politicians who they arm with law that they will go to our parliaments to go and pass. This is the resistance that we need to build globally to be able to insulate and protect our public institutions, our democratic institutions, for that encroachment by the private sector.
Thank you very much, both. I think we are approaching the end of our session. I'd like to make a short resume. I think we all agree that fighting against water privatization is actually fighting for democracy.
Exactly. Thank you.
So we need them to focus more and more, to link more and more, to make it clear to everyone that it's much more than about privatization. It's about keeping our democracies alive. It's about keeping our planet alive, because the danger is beyond now just the social dangers, the ecological danger that's added to the commodification of nature. We are really in a threshold that is very, very dangerous. And I would propose that as a focusing on an alternative to the legal is the ethical. There are several things that are legal and completely unethical. So we think we can all join at the ethical level. And from there, fight against water privatization for life and for our democracies. If you would like to say some last words, or Daniela, if there are questions from the people who are listening to us. So, Andrea, make your statements, please.
Oh, my final statement. I just take so much hope from the fact that, you know, so many of the people that I met, you know, they might not entirely understand the law, which is complicated. They might not entirely understand, as do I not entirely understand, you know, the world of finance or derivatives, or, you know, how the pension fund actually works. But what everyone understands is that water needs to be accessible, and it needs to be managed in an ethical way such that future generations have access to it. I think what Akimbode said about the fact that the Lagos Strategic Master Plan doesn't even mention the human right to water, even though it's been mandated since 2010 at the UN, not mandated, but it was declared a human right by the UN since 2010. The fact that the Strategic Master Plan doesn't even mention that is a profound ethical breach. And that would also be something that I know that water activists all over the world would be very invested in inserting or fighting for to insert into this plan. As soon as you insert this language in this plan, there is a possibility that you can then insist that all human beings need affordable access to a minimum of water on a daily basis in order to just survive. So I have faith in the fact that what Franklin said, that people understand the ethics of this very, very quickly.
Bold, please.
Well, I think I'll just quickly respond to Penny on the question about corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility in itself is an aberration. Corporate social responsibility is what corporations created to whitewash their images, to legalize their sitting on the table when they are not. What government needs to do is to promote corporate accountability. You do corporate social responsibility when you are not paying the actual cost for your production. And cost means things like what you're impacting on the environment, what you're impacting on local livelihoods, etc., etc. The impact of your production on climate. When government through the laws are subsidizing corporations and they're making too much profit, they're paying so less a tax to our democratic institutions, then they, out of the profit, then they take a percentage and then they dangle it like Father Christmas to our people as corporate social responsibility, when our government, as has been earlier said by this panelist, are supposed to invoke appropriate taxes for the costs that they invoke on our people and on the environment. So we don't support CSR as putting them on a higher moral ground. Rather, we ask government to put in place regulations and appropriate taxes, climate tax, environmental tax, to ensure that they pay for the cost of the damages they're doing on the environment. That's the future. It's going to be a long haul, but we should not lose hope and we should keep pushing on.
Thank you very much, both. I would like to remind people that in the South, as Bode knows, we have some wonderful organizations that are allies that should be mentioned. We have Via Campesina International joining, bringing together all. In Brazil, we have the Landless Movement that, by the way, sent a wonderful message to the young people in Switzerland. I can share with you, it's with English subtitles. These well-established, well-rooted movements, they are our allies, and we have to reach to them. And I would also like to remind people that in a very innovative way, in a way, the Catholic Church, the Pope Francis is very much engaged. He did a speech yesterday in the United Nations yesterday in Spanish that is quite striking. His encyclical Laudato Si is very clear about water privatization, and we should try to reach out to such allies, because alone we cannot do much, but together we have a huge power. If there is any other question from the public, or Daniela, if you want to say something, to add something. So, well, I don't know if there are questions, or if you some other last. I don't see questions in the chat now. So thank you all. It was wonderful to talk to you. Thank you to the people listening to us. It was a pleasure to have you all on board, and let's go together. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Franklin. Thanks, Andrea.
Thank you. Good luck, Akimbode.
Goodbye.